Welcome to Wabash Center webinar. The theme today is self-care as we care for one another. I am Lynne Westfield, Director of the Wabash Center. My staff for our webinar is Carly Hollinsby, our producer, and Paul Myrie is the sound engineer. During the show, questions for our guests need to be emailed to Paul Myrie. Please email any questions to myreep@wabash.edu. That's myhrep@wabash.edu. myhrep@wabash.edu. I'm very excited about my conversation partners. These women are healers, they are caregivers, they are elders in our community that we look to for strength. It is my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Marsha Foster Boyd. Marsha is Interim Vice President for Academic Affairs and the Academic Dean at Luther Seminary in Minnesota. Welcome, Marsha.
I'm so glad to be here. Thank you.
And Dr. Stephanie Crumpton. Dr. Crumpton is Associate Professor of Practical Theology at McCormick Theological Seminary in Chicago. Thank you both for agreeing to this much needed conversation.
Thank you for having me.
So Marsha, I'm going to start with you and then Stephanie, jump into the conversation. Marsha, when we were talking about what title to give this conversation, you were the one who suggested we need to talk about self-care as care for one another, which I was very excited about because it locates self-care not in the isolation of one person, but in community, right? Self-care as care for one another is a communal statement. So let's start our conversation talking about self-care is not a selfish act, but it is in and of itself care for the community.
That is exactly what I said, and sometimes things just come up and come out, and it felt so right for me to talk about it in community, because if we don't see ourselves as connected to one another, especially at a time like this, how can we care for ourselves? How can we care for each other? So the interconnectedness for me is critical when I think about caring for myself. We are not alone. We are still in community. And I think this webinar is a perfect example that even though we're in our individual places, we're together.
Yeah. So I thank you so much for starting it off in that way, Dr. Marsha. I think the most important thing is to recognize how panic has a way of creating an abandonment of the self, which then becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? Like we're panicked, and so then you spend all your energy panicking, and then that way you create more chaos, and so then you're not paying attention to the possibilities of survival. It's so funny, like you're so focused on survival that you're not paying attention to the possibilities of surviving the crisis. And so when you situate it that way in terms of caring for ourselves is to care for the community is to care for ourselves, it reminds us that we have what we need as long as we are mindful, right, of ourselves in the community. So like when, I've been part of and also been one to receive such beautiful moments of giftedness in this experience. So I have a good girlfriend who lives around the corner. And so care for self and care for the community. We have a habit now that if one of us is going to the grocery store, if one of us is out, we'll say, "Hey, I'm going. Do you need something?" Or we'll drop things off at each other's houses just to say you're not by yourself, right? And it's just those little things that make it bearable. Those little moments of not just being concern for yourself, but concern for someone else, which also helps us remember not only do we have what we need amongst each other, but that there is enough, right? If we share, there is enough, right? And so like we'll split the cost of like a big bulk thing of paper towels, or or like if one of us is cooking something, we'll share it with the other. And so the importance of recognizing that it's not just a cliche, right, about care and community. It really is. This is how we're going to make it through this, is to literally look out for one another and look at each other, right? Pay attention, hear what one another is saying, check on each other, but then also really pay attention to what we're hearing and being, allowing people to see us, right? As academics, we're pretty good at creating a one-way tunnel vision, kind of like we can see everybody else, but not so many people see us. And so the whole notion of letting people care and love on us can be a little awkward at first because it can be threatening. But what Dr. Marsha is talking about, care and community, is that it's also allowing ourselves to be cared for, not just being the carers, but opening up a two-way street of love in a particularly tough time.
So self-care is not about selfishness.
No.
As a matter of fact, it is the larger understanding that we belong to each other and care for other people and care for the community. We have to take care of ourselves. We have to look at ourselves. So we find ourselves having gone through the phase of the initial shock of the pandemic, right? So the adrenaline rush has gone, but now we're into having to create new patterns, new understanding about how to live in quarantine. So should we, I'm gonna ask some of the obvious questions. Should we take care of ourselves while we're in quarantine? So before we talk about practices, like I'm in quarantine. Should I take care of myself? Should I be thinking about myself in quarantine?
I think you have to think about yourself. And again, it's a both and, it's not either or. But certainly, if I can't care or if I'm not aware that I need to care for myself, it's impossible for me to then be able to reach out to care for anyone else. So my awareness starts with myself. And chances are, if I'm feeling that overwhelming feeling or anxious or afraid, my good girlfriends or my God friends, they're thinking and feeling the same way. So that causes me then to reach out to, and I've heard from people during these weeks that I haven't heard from in a long time. I'm reconnecting with people that are good friends. We say, we got to get together. Well, I'm having happy hour with a friend once a week, and we both just look forward to that time. So whatever it is that I'm feeling, chances are somebody is feeling the same way. And that for me is an indicator that I've got to to reach out, to get beyond myself, to check on people, to check on others. And I wanted to say too that the Episcopal Relief and Development Service created a chart about this, and part of the chart says that there's a heroic phase to what we're going through. And we see that we're honoring all of the people on the front lines and all those that are giving care. And then there's a honeymoon phase where we can do this. We're together. But then
that it drops off. That sorrow, that suffering, that hurt will
disillusionment.
And that's where we are now, I think, where people, we got to get back to work. We got to get out, and people are saying this can't last forever, for us to be in this quarantine situation. We've got to get out. So the disillusionment that I think people are feeling now, and we don't care what the news media says, we don't care what the government says or the physicians say, we're out of here. And I think that's really disillusionment with things as they are. It can't stay this way. It's got to change, and people are taking it upon themselves to just do what they want to do. And I think that's a real sign of disillusionment.
Disillusionment, and what's at stake are other people's lives.
Exactly.
Yes, it's a dangerous moment, very dangerous moment.
It's the antithesis of self-care to me.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot that drives that. I mean, we can go into the political dimensions of it, but I think on one level, another part of it is either the unwillingness or the incapacity to accept the loss of control. Either you're unwilling for a lot of different reasons, or like you literally don't like no one, it wasn't a part of your formation to learn what a barrier is, not a boundary, but an actual barrier. Like it just, some people, their experience just, they just have never hit a no, right? And so when you've not, either you're unwilling or you have not ever had to tolerate the adjustment that a loss of control constitutes, then you do what you know, which is to push, right? And to push regardless of the impact on yourself and or others, because it is a little baffling to me when people who, like, this virus doesn't care who you are. Literally the virus is just like, I don't care who you are, I'm doing what I do. And so it's clear that the virus will attack and harm and kill anyone that it decides to. And it baffles me that with that knowledge, there are still people, and I'm feeling a little short about this too, but there are still people who are willingly putting not just themselves on the line, but other people's lives in danger, right? In ways that they may not have to be in danger, right? And I think that that's a moment where it really reflects some important abandonment of self and disregard for others. And so I think the way back is to learn that you have a self that is worthy of care and that is not indomitable, right? Like no one's Superman. Nobody's getting through this unscathed, right? And so learning learning that your no is also a no for other people, right? Like I'm not really in a high risk group, but that doesn't mean that I should just run around and do whatever I want to in terms of abandoning and safety protocols. But also, it also doesn't mean that I should not take self-care for myself, because if I'm reckless in that regard, then somebody's gonna have to come take care of me, right? And so then I'm perhaps taking resources away from people who might need it, right? And I mean emotional resources. I'm not just talking about in the hospital, but like if I had done what I needed to do to proactively connect with people and take care of myself, or take a time out, or just make an adjustment on a syllabus, or make an adjustment with a class or something, if I had done that, then I would have, first of all, let the community know that something's going on and I need to make an adjustment, which may help them recognize maybe they have some adjustments to make as well. Yeah. But when you don't do that, it's kind of like a trickle down effect, right? It just blows everything out of the way. And so things that could have been averted, right, that we could have had different responses to, we now can't respond on a level baseline. We now have to respond from a kind of a crisis management space, which then just sucks up a lot of resources. Whereas if we just could accept the help on learning how to accept the stopping, then that is an important part of caring for oneself. And it's hard. I mean, the first 2 weeks, I was delirious. I mean, I don't know what was going on. I was tired. And then I was trying to overwork. And it was just, it was bad.
Well, it's such a peculiar time, right? Upheaval is such a peculiar time. And that's why these new patterns, these old patterns, these temporary patterns, there's still time of uncertainty. I was talking to Tatsion Benny Liu in Boston, and his comment was, this is not a time to seek balance in your life. This is a time just to try to survive. Because my question to him was about balance. And he said, no, it would be off kilter to try to hold yourself to a standard of somehow balance, right? And his point was, you're just trying to get up, get yourself together, and then find some sort of survival during the day, that we're working that close to the bone. Do you agree with that? Don't now is not a time to look for balance.
I definitely do. And in the academic setting, I think that we want everything to stay as it is. And the thing that I have been saying day in and day out is slow down, slow down. And I guess people say, well, we know what Marsha's going to say, slow because we have not found equilibrium yet. We're still not on solid ground, and we have to. And I think the caution that I hear a lot is be patient with one another. And for me, that is essential. And that's part of the slowing down for me, is to not expect myself, as Stephanie was saying, at first you're saying, what is wrong with me? I'm so tired, or I can't think. And for me, I had to tell my team, I said, mentally, I'm not tracking. I can't keep all these things in my mind that I had been keeping, able to just go from one thing to the next. And that for me said, Marsha, you have to slow down. You're overloaded. You're trying to stay on this treadmill and it's not working. And so that was my caution to myself. And I apologized in advance. I said, if I forget things, just give me another day, it'll come to me, or remind me. But to be kind to one another and to be patient with one another during this time. And I agree with Benny, equilibrium is hard to come by right now. And that's why it's so important to be patient with oneself and be patient with each other.
But suspending judgment is hard, Marsha. We want to judge ourselves. We want to judge others. We want to hide and say, yes, I'm tracking, when I'm not tracking. Or if I disclose to you that I'm not tracking, what will you think of me? So I had this fantasy that when we started working, our staff started working at home, I would have all this time for creativity. I can't hardly think a thought, let alone be creative.
Nah. Honesty is helping me with this, right? Like, and I had to phone not just a friend, but I had to phone a friend. I had to phone my mother, and so because I did not realize that I was extending grace and encouraging others to adjust their expectations, but hadn't done the same for myself. And I had gone under. You hear what I'm telling you? Under around grading. Grading is a challenge in general. Let me just name that. But in a pandemic, in addition to that, I also picked up another project, right? I had to, like, I called a faculty friend that I knew I could trust, and it was like, I didn't mean to have this confessional moment, but we were talking, and then all of a sudden I was like, I can't hold this any longer. And so I just said to her, I said, look, I am going down around this grading, and like stuff is not done. And I know how it happened. And I made a decision to prioritize one thing over another. And that was a good decision. But I was still holding myself to the expectation that having been in a pandemic added another piece to my work. And then I was still supposed to be able to stay on top of grading. Right. And so there was a shame and a fear behind that. And she just said to me, why don't you just be honest with them and let them know? And so I did. It was humbling in an important, humbling without being humiliating, to just say to my students, look, I'm behind. I don't know when I'm going to get these back to you. I'm doing my level-headed best. And then there were some pieces that just really fell through the cracks with some people that I was advising. And I just had to call them and say, I am sorry, and that opened up air to breathe. Right. And then, and so I did not realize that I was carrying expectations that I had expected others to let go of, but I was still carrying it myself, and so I think the honesty piece about how hard it is, and I'm sorry, I messed up, or I missed it, or I don't know. It's just, I don't know. Has become
part
really
of the
helpful.
Honesty piece is the self-assessment, to say to other people, how y'all doing, but to say to myself, how am I doing? And to be
But
able
I thought I was
say,
okay.
Okay.
See? I thought I did it. I really, and it was like, oh, I'm not okay. Oh.
And you're not okay is when you stopped being able to hit those deadlines.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mhm.
My not okay was when I was not able to hit deadline, and also when I felt isolated because I felt like I was hiding a shameful secret, right?
Ah,
I felt like I was hiding a shameful secret, and it was like, this is only going to get worse. It might be a shameful secret, but it's only going to get worse.
Mm-hmm.
And it took a friend who is a colleague to say, hold
yes,
on,
yes,
let's just be honest about this,
yes.
because missing a deadline is like, as academics, we really do some interesting things with our in our own heads around missing a deadline or what we fear will be the consequences or repercussions if we are not able to perform, even in a pandemic, right?
Yeah.
Well, because we feel like we're being watched. Even in isolation, we feel like people are watching us, watching our work
Exactly.
performance. And they
We've
are.
taken it in. We've taken it in,
Yeah.
right? We've internalized it, so we do our own censoring. We do other censoring of within our own selves.
Mm-hmm.
And I think
Exactly.
that's related to the higher ed and its kind of commitments around progress and success and how do you progress,
Mm-hmm.
which is to be productive. And even if you're unproductive in time of pandemic, it's as if that doesn't matter, and it has to stop, right?
Right. That's right.
Yeah.
I am, the other thing that has really come to my mind through this, and also in my own experience, not just mentally, but also emotionally, is the issue of grief, and how grief is also a part of this. And to be able to name that and to say that we are all grieving one thing or another, or 12 or 25, as this up and down takes place. This, I don't even want to call it a cycle. It feels like a cyclone.
Mm-hmm.
So the issue of grief for me came up. I was invited, just as we were saying, Dr. Stephanie, how you had this dream and then you were invited. So I had a dream. I mean, I was feeling very, very upset on Easter. I couldn't watch any podcasts or any services, and I just sat there and just really was in mourning. And it occurred to me that I was still in Saturday, Good Friday, then Saturday, then Easter Sunday. And that Wednesday after, my church asked me to preach the following Sunday.
Mm-hmm.
So I said, oh my goodness, now I gotta, get myself together. And when I looked at the lectionary, it was about Thomas. I had preached about Thomas, my first sermon, 45 years ago.
Wow.
And here came Thomas again. And I said, well, I'm glad that I'm not the preacher I was 45 years ago, because I wouldn't have preached what I preached.
Mm-hmm.
And what came to me about Thomas was that Thomas didn't show up for that first revelation of Jesus because Thomas was grieving.
Yeah.
He couldn't face it. He was still in Saturday too, and so I had the opportunity to offer that to those who were on the webinar, and just say, allow yourself and know that some of the emotional things that you're experiencing have to do with a very normal process. And that normal process is the grief process, that we are all experiencing all the different stages and phases, and it's normal to feel that during this time. So I said, Thomas is teaching me a lesson. And when he showed up, he said, I just want to see him. And that made me think of funerals where people just want to see the body, and now how we're not able right now to see the body, and just allowing all of that emotional upheaval to come out. And for me, it was a gift to have been invited to preach that Sunday. And I said, we're in 40 days getting ready to get to Pentecost. And during these 40 days, I think I'll experience Easter at some point. But right then, I just wasn't ready. And I realized it was about grieving.
The work of sorrow, the work of suffering, whether your own suffering or watching other people suffer, or knowing about the suffering that is in your county or in this country or even around the world, is devastating. And if we don't give ourselves time to take that in and grapple with it, I mean, we'll either do it now or later, is what my grandmother would say. You either got to work it through now or you got to work it through later, but you're going to have to work it through.
And it's in the air, right? Like you were saying, like I learned to not underestimate what is in the air. Like we're more connected to one another than probably across the globe on this earth than we've ever been before. And it's heavy, right? Like, because I think it's important. There have been times where I woke up and was like, what is happening? And then I was like, no, that might not be all yours. You may just be aware of what is in the air, right?
The sorrow is palpable.
Yeah. So I've had to beef up my self-care practices.
Yes.
Like I can't really go past 2 days without practicing yoga. It's a bad idea. You know, maintenance rituals around smudging with sage. Like it's you have to have a regimen. Like, and this is a great time to develop one if you haven't had one. Like there's no shame in being like, oh, you don't have anything. Go find one. Really, like
that's right.
Because it'll start to take its toll on our bodies, making us more vulnerable to the threat that we're already facing.
I also think it's important to be, as Marsha was saying before, patient with yourself, that if your previous self-care routine and regimen isn't working, to find a new one, right? So the things I used to do before the pandemic, I can't do now for whatever reason. So I have to do new things. I've probably listened to more music in the last month than I have in a very long time, because I haven't been able to read. I haven't been able to walk the way I want, you know, but music has been comforting to me. So that's what I've been doing. But even pivoting your self-care routine is a challenge for some of us. We want to force ourselves into how it used to be.
And that patience, that's why being patient with oneself and therefore patient with others is so important. One thing that I found was that I already had an altar in my space, but this pandemic caused me to move it, to change it, to enliven it in ways, you know, and things were coming to me. I gotta find this, I gotta find that. And bringing all of that to that altar. So that's, as Dr. Stephanie is saying, you know, that there are things that we know to do and maintenance things that we know to do. But I would say also, if you don't have these routines and regimens and that finding things to place on an altar that matter to an individual are critically important during this time, because it helps us to center ourselves and find equilibrium in the midst of the disequilibrium. I moved my altar in front of my fireplace on the floor. I mean, it's like the whole width of the fireplace. I mean, boom. And I said, I may not even take it down in the wintertime. I may leave it there because it's giving me so much energy. And I know that energy is not just in this physical realm, but the ancestors and the spirits are speaking to me as I deal with that altar. So that's another aspect. And the smudging, as you said, you know, all of that helps us to know that we are, what came to mind is we're in a big container, that we are being held, even though in this time it doesn't feel like it, but we are being held. And that altar reminds me that I'm being held by forces and powers and entities that are far beyond this pandemic.
I taught a couple classes called Altering Space, where we actually had the students make altars in a woodworking shop. And we talked about what it meant to let holiness alter us, or to be altered by holiness. So that's a very welcome thought for me, Marsha. Just a thought that takes me to very good places.
You know, Lynn, as you say that, it reminds me of a workshop we did a few years ago, and I was talking about the ancestors, and you said, well, what you didn't talk about is what happens when they show up.
Wow.
You know, we ask them, we make space for them.
Right.
We say, come, we bid ye come forward. And now what happens when they show up? It's like, I think it's also pretty important for us to also, not a disclaimer, but to also offer that, like, these things that we are finding ourselves drawn to, it may seem like a simple move to move your altar in front of the fireplace, or a simple thing to listen to music, but to trust when something then begins to happen.
That's right.
Right?
That's right.
To trust it, right? To lean in towards it, for the betterment of you becoming a better human being in this moment. Now, I didn't say your best self.
No,
I said a
no.
better in this moment, right? And so to recognize that there is probably going to happen that if you start focusing spiritually, that there are going to be things that happen, right? That happen in your mind, that happen in your relationships, that happen in the world, that happen in our work. And the tough part is what sometimes also letting go, right? Once those things kind of come and they feel disruptive, to see it as an invitation and not an obstruction, right? As an invitation to move into whatever this reset is that we're facing, an invitation around how we do our work, how we be, how we care for ourselves. But just to, I think it's pretty important to say that, like, altar building, listening to music as a spiritual practice, like these are physical things that we're doing, but as Dr. Marsha mentioned, it's giving you spiritual energy. Like, so it's a way of opening up a conversation with spirit. I think it's pretty important to also acknowledge.
Well, and our quest or our yearning to belong isn't just about belonging here on this planet. It is about belonging to the ancestors. It is about belonging to spirit. So even if this time creates a kind of numbness about things that are spirit or spiritual, trust that the ancestors do show up when we call. Trust that we are protected when we ask for protection. Trust that we're not alone when we're feeling alone and grieving and in sorrow. But your belonging extends far beyond your own address and beyond your own neighborhood, right? And into other realms.
That is so important.
So for our listeners, if you have a conversation for our guests, the way to get that question to us is to email Paul Myrie at myhrep@wabash.edu. So Paul, we're just about ready for questions, but talk a little bit, Stephanie, you just mentioned yoga practice. Talk a little bit about yoga, because some folks, yoga is very popular, but it also has a dappled understanding, right?
Yeah.
You mentioned a little bit about yoga. Say more.
So I think the first thing I want to say about yoga is that more often than not, we focus on the physical practices of yoga, the things that we see happening, that someone, handstands, interesting body shapes, body forms. And I think that many of those things are possible, but they are only possible if you first find your breath. Breath work is more than 50% of yoga practice, right? You will not be able to get into those positions or anything else like that if you are not breathing. So your first, and not all bodies are meant to make every shape, but all bodies are meant to breathe, right? And so there are ways in which issues of accessibility have become a barrier to what the essence of yoga really is. And so in yoga, breathwork is referred to as pranayama, which is essentially talking about your life force, your life energy that moves in the breath. And so focusing first on our breath work is the number one thing. And most people don't realize that when you get anxious, you breathe up here, right? You're up here.
Stop breathing. You either shallow breathe or stop breathing.
Right. And so you can't speak because literally your brain is not getting enough oxygen. Your body is not getting enough oxygen. So the first thing about that I'm always interested in is encouraging people to learn how to breathe deeper. So you're breathing not up here, but you're breathing in your diaphragm, which is lower, and you're expanding the rib cage this way out to the sides and also to the forward and back. And so it's amazing how much more space you find in your body to breathe, which for me translates into how much more space I find in my life to have creativity, to find options when I feel trapped or stressed out. If I can work on my breath, then I realize that there's another shape my body can take, which means that there's also another shape for whatever the circumstance I'm in, right? And so for me, that's one of the first things that I talk about with yoga is the breath work, right? You'd be surprised what you can do with your body if you're first breathing, right? And so for me, I'm also a yoga instructor. Just finished my training in October. I've been practicing, however, this makes my 8th year of practice. And so part of what's important, first of all, is the breath work. But secondarily, after the breath work, is to understand that there are ways to get into these different, what are called asanas, which are the shapes and the body movement. I'm sorry, I need to plug in my phone because it's showing me a battery issue. Sorry about that. And so asana is about the physical practice, what we understand as the physical practice of yoga. So there's a progression to each one of those things, and that's called sequencing. You don't just hop up and stand on your head because first of all, you can harm yourself. And second of all, the body is not meant to do that. You haven't prepared your body for it, right? And so there are, an example for me about how this comes off the mat for me is that there's a side plank, right? So most of us have seen a plank. It looks like a push-up, right? Well, there's a way to do it on your side where you only have one leg on the ground and one arm on the ground and the other arm is up. You know, it's kind of a fancy kind of thing. And I know that my body is strong enough to do it, but for months I would injure myself whenever the instructor would have us do it. And I feel like I know that my body is strong enough to do it. And then I thought, okay, what's going on? And so one day I was determined to do it, but I also was aware that I was determined to not also hurt my neck. I have a reoccurring issue with my neck. And so what happened was I had to pay such close attention to every single thing in my body and able to get into this position. And so what came of it for me was that I was able to do it. And interestingly enough, the problem was in my neck, but the issue had to begin with my foot. I had to hold my foot in a certain kind of way, which then positioned my leg to straighten out, which then arched my hip, which then activated my side, which then gave me enough strength in my arm, which then allowed my neck to be free. And so what I realized, and that transferred off the mat, is that when I'm being asked to do something, what do I need in order to be able to respond to what is being asked of me and to which I have said yes? And so when we think about self-care and our work and things that we have to do, for me, my yoga practice is critical because it's a place where I work out physically on the mat, but then I recognize that those things are transferable because I've already done it. I've already done a difficult thing without harming myself. But the question was, what did I need to take care of in myself in order to be able to do what's being asked of me externally? And so for me, that's the yoga practice that's one of the ways in which the yoga practice has been critical for me. And also it just, helps, I can experience something that feels kind of like post-traumatic stress disorder in my body. And there are ways in which yoga really helps me to settle down that fight or flight response. And after 8 years in, it now has reset my nervous system so I don't trigger as easily. I don't have as much of a startle response, which is really good during particularly collective anxious times.
I love all bodies are meant to breathe.
They are.
Right. All bodies are meant to breathe.
And they have their own movement commitments too, but yes.
Anybody that knows me on social media for the past 5 years, every now and then I'll say, breathe. I'm breathing. I'm breathing.
I've seen it.
When you realize that you're breathing, you also realize when you're not. And so, because as you say, it feels so different when you're able to be in touch. And so that I'm breathing keeps me reminded. And I was a trained singer. And so that's when I learned about the diaphragm and breathing deeply. So it's important in so many areas to be able to know we've got to breathe. And if we're not breathing, we're not living.
That's it. Mm-hmm. Dr. Paul Myrie, is there a question from our listeners?
There are yes, there's a number of them. I'll start with this one. What would you say to faculty who may be working in places where self-care isn't rewarded?
I don't know any place that rewards self-care, but I,
I mean,
go ahead, Marsha, go ahead.
I think that goes back to what Stephanie was saying, you know, that we are harder on ourselves and we hold ourselves to such a standard. And my admonition to slow down is counterintuitive to an academic. You know, we've got to keep things moving. We've got to keep things going. So I would not look externally right now in this COVID time. I would look internally and ask the question that we, all three of us, have been saying in one way or another. What do I need to make it not just this week, but today? And for some who are having health challenges, moment to moment, hour to hour, what do I need? And in the academic world, I think we're rewarded for this overachieving and overdoing and keeping 10 balls in the air when we only need to keep 3 in the air. And I think our culture, this Western culture, rewards all of that. And we've got to, at this time, you know, the call for innovation or pivoting, whichever way you want to look at it, it's a time to look at ourselves and say, what do I need at this moment? And Stephanie gave the example, you know, the grading, it just wasn't happening. And she had to look at herself. And so that's why I'm saying part of caring for self is to admit, I don't have it together right now. And I can't look externally for a reward for whatever. I've got to look internally, because it's a time for me to recalibrate what it's going to take to make it this day, this week, until whatever, you know, whenever we're able to go outside or whatever it is. So it's not a time necessarily to look externally for validation, but it's a time to look within and say, whether they reward my sitting still for 2 days and not answering emails, I just can't do it. I waited a week to answer one email because it was going to take energy that I just didn't have. And that is a no-no, as we all know, in this academic environment. You're supposed to answer that day. How dare you wait 2 days? And it took me a week. So I would say don't look externally for this validation right now. Look internally and ask the question, what do you need right now?
Next question, Paul.
This comes from Tamisha Tyler. She asks, well, she states and then asks, a lot of my rhythms pre-COVID were connected to space, a space to go to work, to relax, etc. I currently live in a space with 3 roommates, and being stuck in a house with them, I realize that I'm having to make my one rest space, my room, my every space. For those of us that connect our rhythms to physical space, how can we understand finding new rhythms when we lose all of those spaces?
Oh, space is so important. So when you're in a small space, I think I kind of liken it to compartmentalizing and boundaries. Like for me, I can get to a point where I'm like, this goes over here, this goes over there, right? And when you have more space available, that's easier to do. But when you don't, I think part of it has to do with how you also spend your time, right? So it's space and time that are at stake. And so identifying a particular area, right, of the room that is your room, particularly saying that is where the work happens over there. And if there's a way to maybe put some sort of a screen or something up over there around that area to block it off when you're not working, that may be an option. Or if you use what you have to kind of delineate space, right? But it's also about imagination and time. I'm going to be over here doing this at this time. And then when I'm done with it, I am not going to be over there. I'm going to now switch over to this other space. And having moments, one of the things that my yoga instructor taught me was the importance of stopping, like you said, Dr. Marsha, along the way. And when something comes up, when I move from one task to another, to not just go to the next task, but to actually be in the task, finish the task, do what I need to end the task, leave it there, and then move on to the next thing, right? And so I'm thinking about managing time in a particular kind of way, setting rituals that allow you to delineate, this is my self-care time in this space, right? If there's a window, look out the window, create your space within the space, which is tough. Let me just affirm that, right? And if it's possible to go outside and take walks and breaks in those, transition times when you're transitioning from work to leisure, to resting time, going outside of the house as safely as possible, right? Going outside of the house at particular set times, so you have something to look forward to, right? This is almost like a really big work of the imagination. You have to get creative within your limitations. So creating a space, right? Identifying that I'm over there doing work at that time in that space, but when I'm not there, not doing that. But creating breaks away from the limits of your space. And also I have a friend who told me, he said his father told him, sometimes you can't go on a vacation, you can't go anywhere, but you could take plenty of trips in here. So taking moments to visualize being elsewhere, right? Folks have been doing that for a long time, working out an alternative vision that is separate and apart from where they are limited. So again, creating space, delineating space, using your time in a particular kind of way, setting a schedule that is predictable around your self-care needs, getting outside, getting some fresh air, even if it's raining, put on a hat, put on some boots, walk out in the rain. Those kinds of rituals, I think, can make a difference within a very tough, limited kind of space.
Also, I would add the need to grieve over the loss of space.
Mm-hmm.
So whether it's temporary or permanent, even temporary loss is still grief. So rather than taking the attitude of, stiff upper lip, let's sally forth, right? Being sequestered into a single space with so many bodies or into a particular room, you have to pay attention to that loss, that grieving. And that takes work, right? That it is not to be ignored or necessarily problematized as much as it's to be grieved over.
And one thing I was thinking too is to externalize that also could involve some journaling, just to get a little pad and just get it out, just name whatever it is because of that feeling of isolation, that you can externalize it, to get it out of your mind and put it out there. And I was, Dr. Nancy, I was thinking about when you were saying you thought that this was going to be a time to do some artwork. And we're finding that all the things that we wanted to do, or we thought we were going to be, I thought I was going to be doing all this writing. I can't sit still long enough to write anything. I can't, it's just, my mind won't be still. So being in that, in a confined space, I think about our ancestors and how they were confined, but they were able to externalize in whatever ways they could, that we're not confined. We have we have each other. And even in that confined space, how do you externalize that feeling of isolation? And one way is to write it out, just to get it on paper and then see, I was that upset, or I was that depressed, or I was that sad, and then to be able to work on that too. But I think the feelings that come with the isolation are critical to examine and work through.
And to try to curb the blaming, the shaming, there must be something wrong with me, I should be able to cope with this. The writing is not to heighten the blaming and shaming, but to try to satisfy the blaming and shaming and move away from that to more patience and more compassion for yourself.
Exactly.
What's up, Paul?
Here's another question that relates to what you had just been talking about. person who is teaching stress and resiliency to seminary students and students of theology this semester. They say there is a real struggle for their students to achieve some measure of resilience in this situation. And their question is this: in your experience, what do you find are doable spiritual means to resilience? And I think you've been talking about that some.
Mm-hmm. At this moment, I'm not going for resilience. I'm going for survival. I'm not trying to, and if resilience comes, but at this moment, when tomorrow is uncertain, next week is uncertain, we can't see over the crest of the hill or around the corner of this pandemic. Resilience seems like a tall order to me. So I don't know if that's pessimistic or what, but that seeking resilience to me is not the order that I'm trying to follow.
In my on my signature now, my signature is one day at a time. One day at a time. And if resilience comes, I may not even know what it looks like at this point. And I think so. The one day at a time reminds me, Marsha, you made it. It's Thursday. You know, you made it through Wednesday. You made it through Tuesday. So I think and what was coming, Paul, as you were asking the question, is expectations. And we've got to be able to understand that our expectations of ourselves has to change right now. And we've been saying this, I think, the whole time, you know, that everything is not normal, and resilience on this Thursday may not look like resilience tomorrow. I don't know. When Governor Newsom has another press conference and says we're going to be, you know, sheltered in place until the end of May, you know, what do I do with that? How do I? And so resilience doesn't mean necessarily what it meant a month ago or 2 months ago or even this Monday. And go ahead. Mm-hmm.
Well, and if resilience also connotes that we will go back to what it was, it will go back to, there's a, you know, wherever we started from, we will be resilient and return to that. It is possible that we will not return to many of the things that we used to be about before the pandemic. So resilience then has to take a back seat to survival, right? Suppose resilience isn't possible. And we need to get another goal or another metaphor, another way to move our hope forward. So I think even if we're not resilient, that doesn't mean we're not hopeful. That does not mean we are not faithful. That does not mean we don't live with integrity. We still live with integrity. But if we can't be resilient, that does not mean we have not done what we can do.
Exactly.
I also wonder about resilience is about motion, right? Like it kind of suggests that there's a movement, and part of resilience requires a stopping and a settling for repair. And so I'm kind of wondering if some of what the students are dealing with, because I'm thinking about my students, is that they are having a hard time accepting that this is a moment to repair, part of which is hindered by their inability to rest. Half of our students, and probably our faculty and administration too, are not sleeping. And so when you talk about resilience, you know, when you talk about resilience, if the resilience is the concern, you can't do that without restoring first, repairing and restoring, right? Resilience is, when we think about resilience, we're generally talking about the bounce back, right? The capacity to bounce back and show back up. Well, you can't show back up if you have not repaired what has been wounded, right? And we're in a situation where we are continually being hurt by the suffering of this moment. And so if there is to be resilience had, this is actually not the time for it, and not yet. We don't even know where we hurt. And so part of it is, I think, encouraging students, which is tough because we've all talked about how academic environments are about productivity and success. the metric needs to change, right? Around how well are you, right? And because you can't be resilient without having addressed what is harmed. And in order to do that, to heal from it, you need time. And so many of us are not getting enough sleep for a lot of different reasons. And so this is not judgment, but I'm just observing many of us are not getting enough sleep. Our minds are not getting enough. Our bodies are not getting enough rest to be able to integrate this new element of ongoing suffering. So resilience, though it may or may not be a goal, if it is the goal, we're not there yet, right? And so to introduce to students, if it is going to be the goal, because I can't make your goals for you. Now, as the instructor, I can do some things about expectations, right? But it's not time yet. It's not time. I wish I could be more eloquent, but it just ain't time yet.
I love the statement of we don't know where we hurt.
Exactly.
We don't know where we hurt.
Just
This
falling
thing is
out about
still
that.
unfolding. We keep trying to rush to the end or rush to closure or control this pandemic. There is no control. There's a reason why it's called a pandemic, right? There's no control over that. We are like rag dolls being pushed and pulled by this thing. And our insistence that we come to closure with it is not going to happen that way.
No.
No.
And what a gift to be able to teach a class on resilience at a time like this, brother or sister professor. Teach on. You got a great topic for a class during this pandemic. Beautiful.
So give them those tools, give them those reflective tools, but know that it's not time to deploy those tools just now.
We don't know yet.
Yeah, we don't know yet. We don't know yet. We just have a few minutes left. I want to, without question, ask you both to tell us about your entrepreneurial endeavors. Both of the scholars have entrepreneurial endeavors that our listeners want to know about, our viewers want to know about. So Stephanie, tell us how we can get in touch with your work beyond this webinar.
So my entrepreneurial work, you can reach me on a website that is under construction, but if you need to check in with me, you can always catch me on Facebook, my public page on Facebook, my personal webpage, stephaniemcrumpton.com. We are working on it, and it will be the place where I post about yoga classes that I'll be hosting online live for free, probably somewhere about mid-May. And in particular, they will probably happen on Wednesday, early evening. I chose Wednesday in particular because I recognize I can't wait until the weekend to restore. I need it in the middle of the week. And so Wednesdays, and I have the class is open, but I also have a particular interest, and I'm hoping that people who are involved in activism and organizing will join it to create and carve out a space for their own self-care while they are fighting and caring for others. So again, that will be on Wednesdays, probably about mid to late May that I'll start. They'll be posted for those who want to join me online. You can, but they'll also always be posted in perpetuity on Facebook. So you're welcome to go and catch them there.
Thank you, Stephanie Crumpton.
Thank
and Dr.
you.
Marsha Foster Boyd, tell us about your entrepreneurial endeavors.
You can reach me also on Facebook, Marsha Foster Boyd. And my business is Catalyst Connections Global. And what I do is consulting and coaching leaders. So I think we're all leaders. And the type of coaching that I do is transitional coaching. So for those that are wondering, what's my next thing? Where am I going next? Or I'm in mid-career, do I want to keep doing this? Or I'm new at my profession, how do I sustain and gain tools? Or I'm getting ready to retire. What do I do next? What do I, so those are the questions. And the consulting I do is with all these seminaries, all these schools of theology, and working with faculties to figure out where do we go from here. And that was one of the gifts that I was able to give where I am now, to be able to help the faculty begin having hard conversations. Now they say, we need to talk about this. We need to, I said, well, you know, a few months of somebody giving you permission is a good thing. So good luck to the new dean who's coming. But also the other thing that I do is called the Bridge, which is concerned with equity and inclusion, and also transition, that we're all on this bridge, coming from somewhere, going somewhere, and trying to help people through that, and in the business world and individually.
Dr. Marsha Foster Boyd, Dr. Stephanie Crumpton, I thank you so much for this brilliant hour of conversation. You have helped us all. I know I've been helped by the conversation, so you have helped many, many people. And just a few notes at the end, the Wabash Center website will hold the recording of this webinar, both in audio as well as video, so it can be sent out to your networks from our own website. And finally, I would like to thank Carly Hollinsby and Paul Myrie, of course, my fabulous staff, for continuing to do an excellent job. We appreciate you very much. And we're out. Yay! We did it.